Dr. Tedesco is an applied psychologist with an office right here in McLean. She specializes in translating psychological research on motivation, behavior, and development into actionable information for parents. She understands the pressures facing children and parents in our area and is here to share her strategies to combat these challenges. She's going to be telling us all about how to stress less and laugh more, strategies for reducing stress and increasing happiness for families. Welcome, Dr. Tedesco.
Thank you very much, Beth. Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. I love coming to Langley. I know some of you. I live around the corner. I have 3 kids, and so it's a real pleasure to be here today. And I think the topic probably works really well after the blizzard, right? After the week at home with your kids. Maybe it would have been better to say it before the blizzard so that you could think about it, but you know, it's challenging, right? It's challenging being a parent. Oops, sorry. All right, so a few things just to kind of set the stage about parenting. As I said, I have 3 kids, so I do this both professionally and personally. I live it all the time. And the bottom line is that it is tough to be a parent, right? It's always been hard, but particularly I think there are some factors in our culture and society today that make it even more challenging. And the everything is, you know, just the tip of the iceberg for that. And throw in with that the fact that our kids are constantly changing. And so we may begin to get into a good groove, and then they go ahead and you know, move up in their development, and it throws everything off. So if you have that feeling that, you know, just when things start to get easy, something happens, you're not imagining it. Something I feel really strongly about is the fact that a lot of the, you know, there's a lot of the information out there for parents, way too much information. And I know I'm one more voice in that chorus, but you know, a good amount of that information is flatly against what the, you know, research on behavior, motivation, and child development will tell us. And so even when we're trying to seek out information, it's hard to know what information is good. I'm a big believer that if we kind of, you know, figure out our compass, what are we trying to do? What do we care about and value for our kids and our family? Then that can actually make a lot of our decisions simpler in the short run and the long run. And then obviously I, you know, look at the research and psychology to see what can they tell us that, you know, what's already known, and then how do we use that as parents. I'm very strategic, you know, kind of what changes can we make day to day in our lives. So this is just a little bit of a, you know, groundwork. If you were here last year, you've heard me say this because this is kind of my, you know, keys to human motivation in one slide for you. But I can tell you that when parents come to me with challenges, it's, you know, one or more of these needs that their children are trying to get met and are either struggling to have met or, you know, trying in ways that are not helpful for their family's functioning or their behavior. So just understanding that your kids are motivated by these same 3 things as all of us. One of them is competence. That's great. They're hardwired to want to learn new things and to feel great when they do. That leads to confidence and self-esteem. So that's, you know, something we want to make sure that we're feeding with our kids. You're going to hear me talk a lot about connection today because that is really the heart of our influence as parents. It's our relationship with our kids. And that's certainly going to have a lot to do with how much stress we do or don't experience. And then the third one just to keep in mind is that, you know, we're all wired to want to be autonomous, meaning we want to be in charge of our own destiny. It's like, you know, independence times 100. And there are some kids that are temperamentally much stronger in this need for autonomy, and those are the ones that, you know, kind of like to butt heads with you sometimes, but all kids need their autonomy to be developed. And an awful lot of the kind of behavioral struggles that I hear from people have to do with, you know, kind of that need for autonomy. So, you know, if everything's working well, then kids tend to be motivated and productive and happy. This slide, you know, I'm just going to put it up here for you to look at. I know Dr. Stixer was here, I think earlier this year, phenomenal resource, and I think he probably talked some about the mental health struggles that we're seeing in our children and adolescents. The line on the bottom there, I think, is kind of, in a nutshell, the fact that counterintuitively, the kids that are struggling the most tend to be kids that are from affluent, well-educated families. And so, you know, a lot of why I feel so strongly about, you know, kind of sharing this information is that there are things we can do as parents to help, and that's where I like to focus. So, briefly kind of, I've thought a lot about why are those numbers so high, because I think they're horrifyingly, shockingly high. And it boils down to stress. And so that's kind of why, this idea of how do we reduce stress? How do we increase laughter and happiness? So what are some of the factors causing stress? I'm just going to briefly go through them, because what I'm really going to focus on is what can we actually do about it. But I think we need to take a moment and understand some of the factors that are at play in the stress level that both our children and we are experiencing. So, how many of you have had that sensation as you look at your kids' work and think, my Lord, I never did that in 3rd grade, 5th grade, kindergarten. It's the reality, and I think, Langley does a much better job than some schools in terms of the level of academic pressure. But, it's one of those things where our expectations across all schools for kids have increased. And, you kind of trace it backwards from the high school on down, and the pressure to take all of the APs and other high-level classes, and it just, kind of naturally pushes down. Along with that, the same extracurricular activities that we took part in, the sports, the arts, the music, they've become like part-time jobs now. They've become, it's no longer, you just kind of show up and participate, right? Now they've become very time-intensive, sometimes year-round, sometimes, extra coaching and extra kinds of practices. The expectations for the extracurriculars has also increased quite a bit. As a society, we have become really focused on performance and achievement. And I think, frankly, we've fallen out of balance between kind of the effort versus achievement. A long time ago, our kind of American message was one of kind of keep trying, the little engine that could, if at first you don't succeed, try again. We really, kind of admired effort. And nowadays, it's sort of the opposite. The messages that our kids are receiving have a lot to do with the idea of the overnight sensation and, getting rich quick before you don't even have to graduate from college anymore, to become Mark Zuckerberg or someone else. There's a lot of awareness about what each other is doing in terms of performance. And as much as schools and teachers try to curb it, I haven't met a kid yet who can't tell me not only their own grades, but the grades of, their 10 best friends and classmates. And so it really changes the focus for kids in a way that, psychologists know is not healthy. The effort message is the one that's very motivating and very healthy. So that really increases the stress and pressure on kids. Certainly the issue of technology, and Dr. Stixrud did, I'm sure, a wonderful, wonderful job talking about this, so I'll just make a couple of points, is that, being aware constantly of what everyone else is doing is extremely stressful. I think most of us as parents have experienced that, right? Any social media that we consume, that sensation that even though we know that people are choosing what to share, and therefore not putting kind of the unvarnished, unglamorous, warts and all kind of picture about their life, that, we recognize that kind of intellectually, it doesn't stop us from sometimes having an emotional response to what we're seeing, right? That idea that, oh, they look happier, that looks more fun than what I'm doing. I'm just sitting here, in my pajamas with my messy house. So, that has a bigger effect on kids than it does on us. So think about the fact that, we have all of the benefits of sort of the fully formed prefrontal cortex and the experience and the judgment to try to put that into perspective, and it's still a struggle. So for young kids who have none of that to help them, they can't make sense of it, and it's creating, a whole host of problems, along with the fact that they're never really off. It used to be that when we had a bad day, we could go home, right? And, cry to our parents or just, kind of close the door to our room and turn on the music and disappear for a little bit. Kids can't really do that anymore. Somebody's watching whether they're available or not. And so they just don't ever get to truly disappear, turn off, recover in the same way that we all did. And that's having an effect for sure on their stress. Certainly, if we're spending more time online, we're spending less time face-to-face. And I know that Dr. Stixrud mentioned the research that shows we are wired for face-to-face kinds of social interactions. It's not the same when it's digital. And then downtime is so important. So much research shows that, kids need to be unplugged. They need to get bored. That's when they start to, kind of figure themselves out. Here's one that's fun, right? This is awfully hard. It's hard to be, all the messages are that we should be very engaged and we should be, really involved. And that's true to a point, but there is too much of a good thing. And we as parents are really being encouraged to be involved sometimes in ways that are not as healthy for our kids. And so it's a really difficult tightrope that we're walking between being sort of nurturing and supportive and encouraging and, kind of overdoing and inadvertently undermining their independence and some other things. There's this whole issue about the universities. I could talk for a long time about these yield rates and the way they inflate them and create this panic that doesn't really need to exist. But it's a reality, and kids can tell you this. Certainly high school kids and middle school kids often will talk about, kind of getting into college. And again, the research shows that times of economic uncertainty tend to increase stress on everyone. One positive in those, I feel kind of the need to make that counterpoint, is the fact that we are now better aware of mental illness and better able to both detect and treat it. So it's not all bad that those numbers have gone up. There is some good pieced in with that, but still there's an awful lot about that stress that we can do. And so, as I said, I'm very solutions focused. I'm very optimistic. We can make an impact in our kids' stress level and in our own. And I'm going to spend the rest of this talk kind of going through all of these different bullet points. And so I'm grateful that you're all here listening and interested to learn about it. So one of the first things that I think is helpful is to understand stress and to be able to teach our kids about it. Because, I get a lot of parents whose kids have anxiety, and one of the first things we talk about is the fact that that's a real physical response in a kid's body. Anytime that, our sort of worries get activated, our fear gets activated, our body kicks into this, sympathetic nervous system fight or flight response. We were really well designed to run away from bears, to flee mortal danger. And when you look at the things that happen, there are actually really logical explanations for every one of those physiological responses. We don't want to think too much. We just need to activate our body and run. And so the blood actually goes away from the thinking part of our brain when we're activated under stress. Or we energize our muscles and things. But what's happening for our kids is that when they are feeling worried, our body has not evolved to know the difference between being worried about a test or upset about, a problem with a friend versus being chased by a bear, and running for your life. And so when kids are feeling stressed over time, we begin to see some of these warning signs and symptoms. Stomach aches and headaches is huge, particularly in younger kids. Sometimes it can look like this, kind of lack of motivation, and I get parents saying that. My child doesn't want to do anything. They don't recognize that might be, a stress response. Certainly some kids will externalize when they're feeling, under stress, and frankly, some of us as adults do that too, right? When we get really uptight, we just explode and, kind of have an outburst. Here's a fun one for, people who are being tested regularly here in school, is that if they're under a lot of stress, it interferes with their memory and their focus. Certainly sleeping issues come out quite often. Changes in social relationships is a warning sign if you're finding that with your kids. And then, stress over time can morph into anxiety and depression. It can manifest in eating issues, in self-harming behaviors, and, in drug and alcohol abuse. So these are just some things for you to have in your mind as parents as you're looking at your kids and trying to assess whether maybe they're under more stress than you might have thought. A couple of messages just about chronic stress that I think are really useful for us as parents to share with our kids is that, we're not really meant for chronic stress. We're meant to run away once in a while from the bear who's chasing us. We break down when we're under stress a lot. I imagine that Dr. Stixrud touched on the fact that stress can actually change the formation, the neural circuitry of the brain. That's a big concern to me because there is a very specific process happening in our children up, into their early 20s where their brain is being formed. They're kind of our adolescents are at their heightened peak of learning, which is great, but they're also very vulnerable and susceptible to the effects of stress in a way that we as adults are not. Sleep is a huge part of this. I'm sure you know that already, but certainly one of the easiest things that we can do, maybe not easiest, one of the best things we can do to help our kids cope with stress and ourselves is to get enough rest. And then I think we really need to think about the messages that we're giving to our kids about stress, because our culture really glorifies stress, right? They have, energy drinks, and they even have caffeinated candy bars now. Everything's kind of about do more, do it faster, stay up longer. We can counterbalance that message in our own families with our kids, and it's valuable to do it. So in terms of stress, again, along with teaching our kids to recognize the fact that their bodies are under stress, and there are actual kind of physical changes that come with it, we also need to help our kids recognize what makes them feel better when they're stressed. Things that I would call positive coping mechanisms. This is just a very small list. There's kind of an infinite number of possibilities. We're all individual. What I think is important for us to do as parents is to help our kids figure out which things make them feel better when they're stressed or anxious, worried, sad, any kind of difficult emotions, and then help them recognize the connection between doing some of these good positive activities and feeling better. They need to kind of learn that link. And so, we do that through questions. We can't tell them. They don't, learn as well when we just feed them the information. We have to ask them, how you seemed really upset. And then you went and, listened to your favorite song and danced around. How do you feel now? Do you feel better? Breathing is at the top of that list because that's quite frankly the simplest. I think all kids should learn a couple of very small little breathing tools, because that's the closest thing our bodies have to a reboot button. Because we can't, when we're under stress, our heart rate increases rapidly. We can't have both a rapid heart rate and a calm breathing at the same time. They're incompatible. And so even though we can't really control our heart rate, we can control our breathing rate. And so by learning how to inhale and exhale very slowly and in equal measure, 5 counts in, 5 counts out, that type of thing, that actually slows down our heart and kind of turns off our sympathetic nervous system response. But, you can figure out for your kids what works well for them, but it is important to start to develop some positive coping mechanisms for our kids. Why? Because the good news is our bodies are designed not to stay under that sympathetic nervous system response for long. We're built to kind of return to homeostasis as soon as we can, to the resting state. The bad news is that the ways that our body kind of naturally defaults to, and our mind, tend to be negative. They tend not to be good for us in the long run. They tend to be like the short-term, quick fix, Band-Aid type of thing. So what we see with kids a lot, especially younger kids, is avoidance. So if you have an anxious child or just, a child who's experiencing some stress about a particular situation, a particular activity, oftentimes they're going to try not to do it. And we as parents, our kind of nurturing response tends to be, oh, okay, you're not feeling, like going there. I understand. We won't go to that birthday party. The really frustrating thing about anxiety, and the reason why parents generally, if they have a kid with a lot of anxiety, need to learn kind of new ways to parent an anxious kid, is that is sort of the opposite of what you want to do for an anxious kid. Because anxiety it actually grows when we avoid it. And so, we want to just kind of, if we think our kids are avoiding situations because they're worried, we want to, kind of gently, nurturingly turn them toward it, not to aid and abet them trying to avoid it. Other things that kids will do, they look for attention a whole bunch of different ways. Sometimes it's in their tantrums and the outbursts, things like that. Sometimes they're going to look for ways to cope outside of themselves, where they want someone else to reassure them. They want someone to comfort them. Sometimes they're going to actually look to, kind of get new things, right? To shop their way out of it, new toys, new clothes, something to make them feel better temporarily. And then, as they get older and the situation gets more severe, there are more negative ways that they might try to cope. The bottom line to know is that the more positive ways that we give our kids to handle stress, the fewer risky behaviors they do. The research is quite clear on that. So onward and upward to, what are some of the other things that we as parents can do? This one is great for their stress level and for ours, by the way. The connection I mentioned, that's one of those 3 innate needs that we all have, is to feel unconditional love and support from another human being. And for our kids, it's really important that they feel not only our unconditional love, they need to feel like we get them, that we know them. They're changing very rapidly, 7 different developmental stages, particularly once they start hitting, middle school and above. They're really trying to figure out who they are and what they care about. And it's really hard as parents to stay current with them because they are changing so quickly. The way that we can do that is to ask them, right? One of the most connection enhancing things we can do as parents is to have actual conversations, open-ended, where we take the time and say, tell me what you enjoy, what do you think about X? How did you, do at such and such? What was it like for you to go to, that event or to participate in that activity? And that, kind of exchange, it sounds so simple, but when we've had young kids for a long time and we're much more in that didactic, you need to do this, you need to do that, teaching mode, sometimes it's hard to step back and start to ask the questions. The other thing that's really important then is, I have very specific words here for a reason, to notice and appreciate who our child is. Praise is a whole, kind of a double-edged sword. And as parents, we can very often well-intentionedly try to, help our kids feel good about themselves, help them see the positives that we see in them by praising them. That actually can backfire. What works much better is if we take a lighter touch and if we just notice and appreciate. I see that you got all of your homework done first thing tonight. That's terrific. Or thank you for bringing the newspaper in when you walked down the driveway today. Little details like that over time are much better than, kind of you're such a great kid, you're so smart, you're so talented. That kind of comments backfires. And it harms our connection with them. So it's important in terms of keeping kind of this tight bond. I can tell you that, the source of our influence as parents comes from the strength of our connection. And as our kids get older, and once they get into, particularly into their teenage years, when we have much less control, if you will, over what they do, who they're with, where they go, it is really the strength of our connection with them that is going to be the source of our influence. So really important. And it's, the strength of our connection also is the foundation for psychological health and resilience. And so in terms of reducing stress, this is very high on the list. All right, I was here last year and talked about resilience, which I love to talk about because it's sort of the number one psychological characteristic linked to long-term thriving, if you will. And so, those of you who heard that, excellent, but kind of in a nutshell, we just need to remember that if we do too much as parents, then we are robbing our kids from being able to develop their own resilience. It is kind of a seesaw that we have to be careful about. I know I talked about failure. I love to talk about failure. It's kind of one of my favorite things. And I like to talk about the need for it, not, kind of how to avoid it. Because the reality is that failure is part of life and it's part of growth. It's really important for our kids who at the, kind of the world at large are not being fed a lot of these effort messages, right? Everyone's looking at their outcomes, at their achievement, at their performance. And so they can develop these kind of skewed feelings that, it's really bad to mess up. Everybody's going to know it. Everyone's going to, laugh at me. They can, kind of turn into perfectionists. It's good to strive, but, if you kind of tip over into what psychologists would term perfectionism, that's highly linked to anxiety, and then that gets you, back into the stress. So how can we remedy that? We can talk about failure with our kids. We can make it safe for them to fail. We can help them process it. We can normalize it in a nutshell. I am very sensitive to the fact that it is scary to think about letting our kids fail, whether it's letting them forget their homework assignment and, have a repercussion in their grades, or whether it's letting them make a mistake socially. All I can tell you is that we don't make great decisions out of fear. And so fear of failure is not going to be a good guide for us in terms of deciding what's best. What works a lot better is for us to think kind of broader, bigger picture, longer term. What are we trying to, what kind of kids are we trying to raise? And, if we answer that with kind of resilient, independent, those are things that speak to the fact that we've got to let them make some mistakes along the way. And the sooner the better. So, your kids are at a great age. The stakes are not that high yet. So if this is something you struggle with, I'd encourage you to think a little bit about it. If you'd like an easy way to talk to your kids about this, Dr. Seuss says it better than anyone, as always, the brilliance of that man. But this particular quote is straight from this book of the places you'll go. And if you have no other ideas, read this with your kids and talk about it. It is remarkable how this little message right here can have such a big ripple effect on them and can truly reduce their stress. So, I'm not going to talk too much about these, but I'm just showing them to you. When I look at the literature in psychology that, looks long-term, they define success and happiness many more ways than I could ever think to do it. From very extrinsic performance-based things like job title level, income level, those types of things, to more self-reports, how content do you feel, how happy, those types of things. The same kind of characteristics keep bubbling up. Resilience, obviously, at the top. Self-control is a huge one, and that's why the topic of technology is so relevant, because the instant gratification world that technology brings to our kids is counter to the development of self-control. And we can use technology to increase self-control by setting limits and teaching our kids how to adhere to them. But it is a challenge. It's a kind of new added challenge for parents, I think, than in previous years, where the world at large enforced some measure of patience and self-control in it. And then you can just take a look at the rest of these. These are all things that through our parenting, we can nurture in our kids if we value them and want to. So, it's choices that we have. Here's the simplest one. When I think about how do we increase happiness, this is it. The research on happiness is really remarkable, because it shows that once your basic needs are met, the amount of money or other things that you have has very little relationship on people's happiness reports. Instead, what shows to be the most highly related to happiness is how much we appreciate what we do have, whatever that is. So how can we do this with our kids very practically? Talk to them, have conversations. Tell me something you're grateful for today. Make it part of your dinner time or your bedtime. Build it into family rituals. It sounds so simple, and yet the literature is really quite convincing on it. All right, independence. This is literally a whole hour-plus talk that I often give, so I'm giving you bare bones here. But I can tell you that it's really important to encourage independence. This is another one of those fun little seesaw things where, in order to give them independence, we have to draw back some of what we're doing. In a nutshell, what we have to do is, kind of a gradual increase in their freedom and responsibilities. The two should go hand in hand in order to increase independence. Back to this idea of failure, but it's more than that. We need to let them own it. Whether they are having positive outcomes or negative outcomes, they need to feel that ownership of it. As much as we think we're helping them when we're trying to get involved and prop up, there's a point at which they start to experience that negatively. They begin to question, do they think I can't do this myself? It actually can undermine their confidence and their resilience if we overdo for them. So we really want to make them understand that link and to feel responsible for the success and failure. So what does that mean? It means we got to get off the field of play and over onto the sidelines where we can cheer them on, but we're not actively engaged in what they're doing. We should be mindful, and I have checklists, lots of checklists out there of kind of what are the life skills that you need to function as an adult. Many of them are things that go under-noticed and underappreciated in our kids' kind of cheap academic years, right? Leading up to college, everyone's focused on, can they Can they get good grades? Can they manage their homework assignments? Can they show up for class? Those are pretty easy to pay attention to. But the research shows that some of the things that cause the most stress in college students are the life skills. Do I know how to do my laundry? Can I figure out how to register for my own classes? How do I get my books? I have to put a quick plug. There's a book from a former dean of students at Stanford. It's called How to Raise an Adult. Her name is Julie Lithcott-Haynes. She's coming to McLean on May 2nd. The Safe Community Coalition, which admittedly I'm a part of, is bringing her to come and give a talk. I've met her, I've heard her speak, she's terrific. Her whole thing is the fact that she was seeing these kids who got into Stanford, which is the most selective university in the country by yield rates, and they were completely unable to manage college life. They were on the phone with their parents constantly. And as she said, not only was that disturbing enough over her decade of being there that she saw this kind of big uptick in the parents wanting to be involved, but she saw a subsequent kind of desire from these highly achieving college students to have their parents in the details, the nitty-gritty of their everyday life at college. She said that was the scarier part. Like back when we were in college, right? You wanted to call your mom to have to figure out how to, get from one class to the next. And, it was just such a shift. So we want to make sure that we're paying attention to everything they're going to need to know. And then again, here's that fun, our best intentions can sometimes be too good, too much of a good thing. In order to give our kids more independence, we have to draw back. And so knowing how to do that systemically and understanding the value of doing that is really important. Why is that? Because here's really the goal. And, if you have only one mantra, I say this, I think, every talk I give, because I think if you're only going to remember one thing as a parent, this is a pretty good choice. The idea that we need to make our kids as best equipped for whatever life throws at them, rather than, trying kind of, well-intentioned but in vain to keep smoothing out the road for them. All of those different metaphors, the snowplow, the helicopter, the curling, I've been told is a metaphor in Canada. All of these ideas that we should smooth the road for them, it's not ultimately what's going to help our kids be the most successful, the least stressed, feeling the best. I mentioned downtime. I can't say enough about this because, again, the goal of adolescence has always been to find yourself, for kids to figure out, they need to figure out who they are, how they're different from us, their parents. They need to figure out what makes them feel good, what things, kind of really motivate them and really, engage them, get them to those points of intense flow and high motivation. And they can't figure that out when their brains are always busy. So, that's one of the concerns about not having that space and that time to get bored. That's really where they start to figure out for themselves, what can I do? What should I do? What do I want to do? This is really hard. I mean, I get this. I know it. This is kind of meant to be a joke, but I live this too. The fact that free time is at a premium nowadays. All of our kids have way more options for what to do with their time than they have time. And that's true for us as adults too, generally speaking. That's a really great thing. It's wonderful to have choices. But part of why the affluent, well-educated set of kids are struggling does have to do with this. There's a lot of research that shows that when we have enough money to have a lot of choices of ways to do things for our kids, it becomes very difficult. It's hard to say no. It's hard to prioritize. It's hard to figure out how much is too much. And so, we just need to realize that there is a need for some downtime. I don't even know, I just grabbed this chart because I liked the concept. I don't know the study it's from or anything else, but it illustrates the idea that we as parents do best if we stop. The day-to-day grind is exhausting, right? It's all consuming, and it can be a luxury and a challenge to look farther ahead and say, okay, what kind of adult do I want my kid to grow up to be? How do I hope he or she turns out? But it's worth doing if you've never kind of stopped and thought about those questions, because it is one of the easiest ways to reduce our own stress as parents. Because if we have a clear sense of kind of the top couple of characteristics we would like for our kids long-term, then when we're making decisions in the short term, do this or not, do that or not, we can kind of do a little checks and balance. Does this get me toward the goal that I have established? And so, we get fed as a society, again, all of these messages about achievement and performance that add to the pressure. But, and I'm not saying that those aren't valuable. They are valuable, but we need to provide that balance. And so as parents, if we can take the, kind of the time and the effort to consider their psychological health as much as, we and everybody else is considering their kind of extrinsic achievements, that will do a lot of good for the stress level. So you can see here, these different options, and, we're all different, and that's a great thing. We don't have to have the same idea of what is success. What's important, I think, is to know what we care about and then to share that with our own kids. Here's one that works really well after that blizzard. But, I show it all year long, and I show this to teens a lot when I talk to them, because I think it's so important for us to give them this message that there's not one right way. One of the things that is the most stressful is feeling like, everything you're doing is high stakes and that you have to, kind of keep hitting each benchmark in order to progress. Much less stressful to believe that sometimes there are going to be twists and turns. Sometimes we're going to veer off course. We can right that ship. We can get back in line. We can, kind of get wherever it is we want to go more than one way. This is a message I think kids are never too young to start to hear from us. Something that's worth noting is the way that our brains work. We tend to, our hindsight bias it's called, we tend to believe that kind of the outcome was preordained, if you will, much more likely to happen than if you had stopped us back in the beginning of those moments of uncertainty than we would have realized. And so what that means is that when we talk to our kids, we often can present it as if, I always knew I was going to end up, working with parents in McLean, Virginia. I had no idea of that, but, it's just where we're at. It's hard to remember all of the uncertainty and all of the little decision points. So therefore, even when we're very well intentioned, we're not as able to present a clear message to our kids about that. So the more you can share with them, kind of the left turns you took, if you will, the more you can share with them your own setbacks, kind of those blessings in disguise, things that ended up for the better, but you didn't know it at the time. Those messages are really great for kids. They take a lot of that stress and pressure off of them. And back to that idea of looking longer term at success, I ask parents to think about how they'd like to describe their child at 30. I probably did that last year even. The reason for that, again, is that as intensive and, kind of high stakes as their academic career is and can feel like to us as parents, as well as to them as kids, the reality is once you get through that, and on to the next 3/4 of your lifetime, if you will, it fades very quickly. And so it's not to say that we shouldn't pay attention to it when we're in it, but it is to say that we should also look farther. We should also look at, kind of, we're not done once they get through college, right? We want them to be thriving adults. And so what are the things that, we really care about for them in adulthood, taking away all of those other, kind of short-term academic pressures. So, that really does help if you haven't ever thought that way, I think, in reducing the stress on you as a parent. So here is, kind of my mantra here to remember that, it's kids, we all know this. I know all of you sitting in this room know that it's who your child is and not what they do. But kids aren't always getting this message. Again, our society is giving them very specific messages right now that are kind of the opposite, right? It's very focused on the accomplishments. And so if we can keep this in mind and share it with our kids, we're all going to feel better. I love this quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson: "What lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us." And we think about the stress and the pressure that we're under. Really, if we can keep that in mind, that it's sort of what's in here that's going to guide everything else, that goes an awfully long way to taking off some of that pressure and allowing us the freedom to have more fun. So how do we, kind of in a nutshell, stress less and laugh more? I'm a big believer, let's keep it simple, right? So knowing the things that our kids are, kind of trying to achieve, they're trying to become more competent, they crave a strong connection, loving connections with us, and they want to become ever more autonomous. They want to have some say in their own lives. Recognizing those things exist and, adjusting our parenting so that we're feeding them in a positive and healthy way. That takes care of, a good amount of the stress, frankly, that we can feel kind of between our kids and our family. And then for us as parents, kind of taking that long-term view, sharing it with our kids. And, as well-intentioned as we are for each other and as important as the social support that we parents can provide to each other is, and I would never underestimate that because I think it is hugely beneficial for parents to have other parents to talk to. But we sometimes feed each other, right? Emotions are contagious, and one person's anxiety is catching sometimes. And so, I hear so often from parents that they were feeling really good, very calm. They kind of had a sense of what they were trying to do, and then they went to, a parent coffee or they went out to dinner. And, there's nothing wrong with, kind of everybody having their own way. But I think we feel the best ourselves and our kids feel the best with us when we are calm and, kind of have our own anxieties under control. And so we don't want to get fed by somebody else's opinion of how many extracurriculars they should be doing, or what high school their child wants to go to, or what kind of future they envision. We need to really keep it very personal and stay confident in our own decisions for our kids. Okay, so I've left lots of time for questions. Hopefully you all have some, but I appreciate your patience and I appreciate you coming out in the snow to hear me.
I have a question to ask. Thank you very much for the talk. That was not very stressful.
Are you more stressed or less stressed?
I'm definitely more stressed because I was not aware of some of those things. So I have to go back and repeat.
We're all works in progress, so.
Yeah. The very first slide you had that it said like 49% of the kids have mental health. Is that the environmental born disorders or the ones, do we include the ones that genetically they were there, or did we create all of this 49%?
First of all, no, we did not create all of this. It's a very complicated, those are the statistics of diagnoses. Many factors feed into them. So genetics certainly feeds into it. Environment feeds into it, but by environment, it's not just, our own family, it's parents. And I can put that slide back up. The takeaway I think that's important for us as parents is to realize that our kids' mental health is worse than, our generation's mental health were. And one piece of that puzzle is the increased stress that they are under. And so I use that as motivation as to why it's so important for us to be mindful of the stress and to do what we can. It's not saying that we can prevent for our kids, that's not always possible. We can mitigate, hopefully, we can improve the situation for them. We can help them if they, these are treatable issues. So if our child is struggling, we can, know enough to know that there is treatment and, that things do get better. So here, I'll put it up for you. But it's not, nobody has been able to figure out exactly, there's no cause and effect per se.
If you have two, let's say two twins in the same family, same environment, same school, same everything, same parents, is one child, could one child have been born with more innate and intrinsic ways towards stress versus the other child that may be more apathetic and more, or it's something totally born with the environment?
I think it's both, to be honest. I mean, they're getting better at, the research is always evolving, but, it's still a mixed bag of temperament, some of which is inherited, some of which is shaped by the environment. It's really, they use twins in doing a lot of the research because that's sort of their marker for if everything's the same genetically, and they look sometimes at twins raised apart versus twins raised together. But the reality is that we as parents, we don't parent the same children in our own family identically. It's not possible, right? There's a lot of effects of, kind of what all is in the mixture in terms of ages, gender, temperament, etc. So it's unfortunately just not that clear. Where I come down, my focus in the work that I do is very much on what things as parents can we be aware of and do differently that might help our kids. So unfortunately I can't answer in terms of the biology. All I can do is I stay focused on the solutions. What strategies are there for us as parents? But it is a very interesting question. Yes.
I would just make a comment. I was listening to a psychologist talk one time, and the question came up, I have these kids, they are living the same lives, and he said something that I thought was brilliant. He said they don't have the same siblings. And so
Exactly.
we might think about siblings.
We affect each other, absolutely. It's a system, for sure, the family. Yeah.
So you had a really nice list about for parents to identify, how stress manifests itself in children. Do you have any recommendations on strategies to teach our kids how to self-identify when they are stressed?
That's a great question. Yes, one of the things that when parents come to me if their child is struggling with anxiety, one of the things that I always do is help them figure out how to explain it to their kids, because we need. I think the slide before this that talks, I think it's worth educating our kids. What is that fight or flight response? Because a lot of times, kids will feel like they're being told that their stress is kind of all in their head, and it's not. It's in their body too. They have energy that has to dissipate, which is why they often will just lash out, and tantrum when they're young, because they don't know what else to do with it. So I think one piece is describing, you can even, with young kids, sometimes I'll recommend giving them like a little outline of a person and talking about where do they feel things in their body. The more we can tune them into that physical response, the better. And then talking to them, as we notice some of these symptoms here that we think might be stress induced. We're not going to be able to say to our kids, you have a stomach ache because you're worried, because that, we need to be careful that we don't invalidate their feelings. That's why if we go back to, what, you do have a stomach ache, you're right. Perhaps that stomach ache, it doesn't appear to be because you have the flu. There are no other symptoms of a contagious illness. But did you know that sometimes our worries actually trigger this response where our digestion stops so that we can run away from, mortal danger, and having the digestion shut down gives us a stomach ache. And so you're right, you do have a stomach ache. Let's talk about what you can do. What are the things, what are some positive coping mechanisms, if you will? What are some things that make you feel better if you have a worry? And kind of addressing it that way. So this slide is really for us as parents to become kind of aware of behaviors in our kids. I so often get parents, kind of saying my kid's doing these things, but not understanding for sure what might be driving it. And, it's not saying that it's always stress, but, more often than not, when we're seeing these kinds of symptoms repeatedly without any physical cause, if you will, they're stress response symptoms. Yeah. There you go. I'll go back to you. Go ahead.
I know it's all about balance, and I've got a middle schooler, so trying to give a little more independence is certainly key. But I'm wondering if you have a little bit of advice in terms of giving them that independence and then pulling back when they don't use it appropriately without adding the stress.
Yes.
You didn't do that. You're supposed to do that.
Yes, absolutely. So, the mantra is freedom within limits. Our goal as parents in terms of teaching our kids how to become more independent, we want to mimic the real world for them, essentially, right? Our job is to teach them how to function the way the real world functions. The real world functions on cause and effect, when then, if you will. When you speed too fast, then you get a ticket. When you don't show up for work, 2 weeks in a row, then you get fired. Those types of when then. As we're giving our kids increased independence, increased freedoms, we want to make sure that, it's got sort of a responsibility component to it. They earn the freedom through becoming more responsible, and that there are kind of as much as possible natural consequences in place for them to use, not in a punitive punishment sense, but in a learning sense. So for example, if they're going to be responsible for their schoolwork, we have to let them forget their schoolwork for them to learn the natural consequence of, you don't, turn in your work on time, then your teacher or your boss is going to do something about it. That's, we want to show that to them gradually. We learn best when we have sort of a nice, gradual, smooth transition. But that's really what we need to do. We need to kind of transfer. When they're babies, we have to do everything for them. And when they're adults, we're ideally, kind of more in a emotional relationship role than in a doing a lot of stuff for them role. So how do we get from one to the other? We need to keep handing over pieces of responsibility and independence to them. That help? Okay. Other questions? Yes.
So I have a 3.5-year-old and a just turned 5 this weekend, and so my stress level is
Yeah.
This is like all like great about homework and all, but how do you get to like daily stress? Like, I mean,
Yes.
getting my kids just out the door in the morning, don't play with that toy, you have to get in a car, like, I feel like when I get home, it's like, go play, I have to make dinner,
Right.
get in the bath,
Right.
go to bed,
Right.
rest, sleep now.
Yes. And you're exhausted by the end of that, right? I mean, it's tiring. Yes. Well, one of the things that really helps is to be consistent, to have again, freedom within limits. So even for a 3.5 or 5-year-old, you want to have some room for them. The freedom feeds that autonomy. The limits are actually comforting. Kids who don't have limits fare poorly. It's not a positive for them. But what they need is limits that are consistent and predictable, right? And that don't shift a lot. So they have to know. So for example, you could have, an expectation, if you will, that they hang up their jackets, put their shoes in a particular place, and maybe you have the limit that they get, I don't know, a half an hour of screen time or something if they have, done X, Y, and Z chores around the house, or however you structure it as a family. You just want to make sure that you're very clear with them about what you are, what they need to do, what they're expected to do, and the link between them doing their work, if you will, and then getting these freedoms as a result. So a lot of times we try to do too much for them, A, because it's a lot faster and we're under time pressure all the time. B, because it's harder to, teach them to do it than it is. We're very skilled in all of these things with daily living, and so it's harder. Pick, a couple of little things for them to do, and once they master them, add in something else. It really, chores is a funny thing, and not just chores, but kind of responsibilities, the drudgery of life, if you will, because that competence that I mentioned at the beginning, that kind of innate desire to learn and feel better, the research shows that kids who perform regular chores do have a positive, in a lot of different ways, they have positive outcomes for it. Part of it's because even if they don't want to be the one to go get the mail, they feel good about being capable of going and getting the mail and contributing in that way, particularly when we as parents remember to notice and appreciate it. Hey, you brought in the mail for me, thanks. That kind of thing. So it is helpful, the younger the better, to, kind of bite off a couple of little nuggets and, have them be in charge of it. Now, I have to say, this is hard because they're going to do things sometimes not to our standards or not in the way that we would do them ourselves. We're going to have to look the other way sometimes. I can particularly, I have a child that wore his shirt inside out and backwards for, I think, a year straight. And, his job was to dress himself, and, But you can always define, as long as you're consistent and reasonable developmentally, you can define being dressed and ready as, having the shirt right side out. It's up to you. It's just, you have to kind of decide which things you're going to put your emphasis on, and then, go ahead and encourage and nurture those. Yes.
Would you say, probably depending on how you define stress, but would you say that there would be some sort of healthy level of stress, and our goal should not be to create a completely, it's impossible,
yes,
but even in theory,
yes,
create a completely stress?
That's an excellent point. Yes, there is no question that some amount of stress is positive. Again, the research shows that the butterflies that we feel before we perform or participate in a sport or something like that can actually improve performance. It activates our energy in our body. It can sharpen, kind of our reflexes and our thinking. So the goal is not to eliminate stress, for sure. Excellent point. The goal is to, know where that tipping point is, to recognize, to know our kids, to know what, kind of too much stress looks like in our kids. And when we see them starting to tip past kind of manageable, healthy stress, to, pull back some of that stress. And, that was part of the resilience message too, is that, there are two ways to address it if our child is, kind of struggling. Part of it might be to reduce the stress, but part of it might be to increase their capacity for handling stress, to increase their tools, to help build the skills in them so that they, can tolerate more stress. And as our kids get older, they kind of move from being soft shell crabs into hard shell crabs, and they learn how to process their emotions and how to manage their stress, and they can handle more of it. So yes, no question. That's why one of the concerns for me is that we're kind of pushing down our expectations so that we're expecting more from them at a younger age, because human development has not sped up to keep pace with kind of our increased demands and expectations on our kids. And so we've gotten a little bit out of sync. That's one of the changes that I think is feeding those very high statistics for the mental health. Yeah. Yes.
What about parental stress and your children experiencing that? We have a 6-year-old nephew with an inoperable brain tumor, and his little brother is going in for a biopsy on Friday to rule out lymphoma. And so it's just,
Goodness.
and so it's creating a lot of stress,
Right.
and having to hide that from children.
I'll be honest, you can't hide that from your children completely. You can hide some of the details, but our kids are brilliant observers of us as parents. And so even if we think that we're kind of covering our emotions for them, we're likely not. So the question is, how can we present our emotions in a way that doesn't, scare and increase their stress? It's really difficult. I think, when you can kind of make it developmentally appropriate for them, but honest, just kind of, I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I'm going to, we hope for the best, and we all we can do is love them and support them, and, you kind of don't feed them too much information. But if they have questions, their questions, kids' questions really guide us. They tell us how much they want to know. And so if you kind of, wait and see what they're coming to, make it safe for them to talk to you, first of all. Kind of meaning that when they do ask questions, try not to shut down, gloss over, which are all understandable responses when you yourself are feeling high emotion, but as best you can, kind of allow room for their questions, and then give them kind of a short answer and see if it's enough. And, if it's not enough, then you give them more, but you kind of dole it out in little chunks. Sometimes we give them, if they ask one question, we kind of give them the full download. When they didn't really want the full download, they just wanted a little something. So, kind of little pieces like that. And, if you don't have answers, it's okay to say that you don't have answers, because they'll sense if you're, fudging anyway. But, just give them that message that, you love them, and, that you're going to do everything you can to help them and to help your family. That's a really hard one. Other questions? Yes.
As they get older, the whole grade thing is really challenging, because, it's all about curiosity and wanting to learn, which, you went to Montessori and they were all about that.
Yeah.
But then as they get older, it's like, you really want to be curious, but you have to get straight, and then even going to the orientations for the high school, the first thing you walk in there open-eyed, and the first thing, one of the adults comes up to you is like, how are your grades?
And my 7th grader was like, oh, armadillo, okay, they're great.
So even if you don't say it or someone else isn't saying it, they're getting it from all sides. Like,
Yes.
other parents talking about, you have to get straight A's to get into this school, this school, this school. So that's.
It's such a problem. It's such a challenge. And I'll be honest, you cannot prevent your kids from feeling grade pressure and things. It's not going to happen, because even if you are giving them the types of messages I'm talking about. They're getting from their peers and the world at large and other adults exactly what you say. All we can do, I think, is present to them, the counterpoint, if you will, and we can reiterate what we value for them. Again, it goes back to the message of, you know what, votes of confidence are a fabulous thing for parents. Sincere, authentic votes of confidence. So, if, for example, a child comes home and says, I really want to go to Harvard, I need to get straight A's, you can say, you know what, I'm sure that's a great school, but there are many great schools, and, your work ethic, your, determination, your curiosity, those things that are part of you are going to help you wherever you end up. And I'm excited for your future, and don't let, if they, because sometimes they're kind of bouncing it off of us, but even if they come kind of, hell-bent on, I'm going to Harvard, all we can do is just remind them that, wherever they go, they have a bright future because of these specific internal characteristics that they will take wherever. And then, what happens, happens. But, it's a very different experience for a child who is striving for something but feels comfortable that there's a backup plan versus a child who, feels like they've got to make something happen. And, it's certainly from a mental health perspective, there is a world of difference between, the mental health of those two beliefs.
Well, on the flip side, how about the child who's saying, well, I'm going to be a quarterback for the child?
Who
doesn't play football.
Yes, I was going to say, there's a healthy amount of imagination that's acceptable at young ages. So, if they're not, in high school saying that, then, you can kind of smile and say, again, good time to plug effort, right? Hey, if you work hard at that, if you decide that's what you want to do and, put all of your energy into that, then, I believe anything's possible. Or, if it's something that's truly impossible, you probably want to say that while giving them the message that they can find something equally thrilling for themselves. But, you've got to just remember that kids throw out all kinds of things. Sometimes we take what they say too literally and, get ourselves wound up over certain things when they're just testing things. Some kids are, kind of expert at, kind of poking us for reactions, and it becomes almost like a game to them if we're really good at giving them the reaction they want. It's a sense of power for them. Ooh, if I say this, I can get a really big reaction out of my parent, and, who knew that little 8-year-old me could throw my mom into a tailspin? That's very motivating and reinforcing if we do that. Yeah.
But just as a follow-up, more realistically, when you try to give guidance and also give independence, my quandary is that I will hear, well, I'm going to be a writer. I don't really care about the math part. And you're like, well, there are lots of steps to becoming a writer. And so he wants to designate his own energy and his interest and his passion to the things that are important to him.
Yeah.
And how do you then add a little bit of stress?
And it's a great question, Sarah. So we want to use our best friend, the open-ended question. And, kind of one of the most valuable things, by the way, that we can teach our kids is how to problem solve. This goes back to independence. Instead, we have solutions, really good solutions to a whole bunch of different things that are going to face our kids. And it's going to be really tempting to just feed them what to do over and over again, because we're probably right in a lot of the cases. However, what our kids need to learn how to do is to evaluate their, brainstorm options, evaluate the options, select one, carry it out, feedback loop to see how well it works. Like, that's the process that they need to learn. And so wherever we can find pockets, and you're giving a perfect example of one, where we can turn it back on them, so you want to be a writer, that sounds terrific. Do you know what things does it take to become a writer? What does it look like to be a writer? Do you have any idea how could you research that? How could you figure that out? Who could you talk to? If they say, oh, well, I know I don't need math because I'm going to be a writer, you can say, oh, well, have you looked into that? Because I imagine if you look at, a college curriculum, even for an English major, they're going to have some requirements. Do you want some help checking that out? I'll be glad to, don't go do it. But, I'll be glad to sit with you if you want to look into that. But, just turn it back on them to help, help them recognize what they need to know in order to make a good decision. that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Is it possible you can put up the slide again of what is a successful person, kind of like
The characteristics?
the characteristics?
Sure.
And then, what is appropriate level of children feeling failure and stress over something like looking back at my life?
Yeah.
You know, I feel sorry. I even like cried over like a bad grade, you know, like
Yes.
in fourth grade.
Yes,
I
yes.
mean, when you are within that time, when you are at sixth grade,
Right,
seventh
right.
grade, how much, what is the level of appropriate sadness and stress and failure over a grade or over a forecast?
Right, right. Well, and I'll tell you, you know, and I don't mean to sound flip, but the answer is kind of the level that they can manage effectively. It's sort of, you know, every child differs in their capacity to tolerate, you know, worry, to tolerate failure, to tolerate different things. We can help them increase some of those tolerances, but, you know, there are some temperamental differences. So, you know, our goal is to help our kids, to provide our kids with the supports that we can to help them thrive. And so, you know, one of the things that you said I think is really interesting is it's so true, right? That hindsight is such a, you know, we look back and think, why on earth did I worry about that? But the truth is, particularly for our kids, like their fourth grade emotions are real and important and valuable. You know, like we don't want to inadvertently, in our attempt to kind of normalize, you know, sort of success and failure and things, we don't want to gloss over their true experiences. It's important to validate, you know, how they're feeling. And so what we really want to do is help them learn to recognize what their emotions are to increase their awareness, and then to help them learn strategies to process their own emotions. And so again, it's all about, it's on them. It's not us doing it for them, us cheering them up, us telling them, you know, giving them the perspective. It's about us asking them the questions. How do you feel about that? You know, do you have any ideas of what you could do in that situation differently? Or, you know, do you have any thoughts on what next time, you know, you might rather? Those types of questions to try and help them enlighten. And then just to kind of mirror back to them what we're hearing and seeing, rather than, again, you know, feeding them actions, feeding them, you know, things to do. It's really valuable. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
So I'm a 6-year-old who seems to be dealing with sadness because of a nanny that's retired, and certain things trigger it.
Mm-hmm.
And I've tried to deal with it directly, and she doesn't seem to have the self-awareness to, you know, articulate her emotions and acknowledge and even identify them. So a therapist a year or two ago had suggested that for kids at that age, play acting would be a better option. Can you talk about
Absolutely.
that?
Sure. That actually, you know, for young children, that is sort of the therapy. Is they call it play therapy, where they allow, you know, give kids sort of the space to create fictional scenarios in which, you know, kind of whatever's top of mind for them starts to come out and present. So the ways that they play, the words that they use, the scenarios, you know, that they develop help to kind of tune in, and they can help them process it. So, you know, follow your child's lead on that. You know, kind of validating their emotions. There's a great, and this works also for you in this, you know, really sad situation. There's the movie Inside Out, therapists love, because it does such a great job of personifying different emotions in a way that kids can kind of get. And so, you know, that's one tool, and there are lots of books too, where you can talk about your kids, to your kids, that, you know, you feel sad. What does sadness feel like? What are other emotions, you know, that happen? And to allow, you know, kind of to let them know that sadness is one of the things inside of us, and it's not, we're not meant to kick it out, right? It's part of us. You know, and that it's part of the range of being human. And, you know, just to give them, again, that security that their feelings are both real and okay. You know, and what to do with it. It's sort of a tricky, again, kids are really good. We're all motivated to kind of get our basic needs met. Not always as, you know, elegantly as we could, but so with kids, they struggle when their needs aren't being met, and we see it behaviorally, emotionally, and things. So kind of following their lead and looking for the signs that they're giving us can help us kind of determine if they need some more support. But yeah, for young kids, for sure, imaginary play. And that's one reason why I really like using books as well, because it can become about a character instead of them. And so you can start to talk, like Alexander and the No Good Whatever Day is one most people know. There are some others that are a little more therapeutic-ish, if you will, a little more didactic. But you can talk about Alexander when you have a kid who's just, frustrated beyond belief. Are you having an Alexander day? He becomes the stand-in for that kind of emotion. So you can find, different books, movies, play that can allow them a shorthand access to a certain kind of feeling.
I think that we need to wrap it
All
up.
right, we need to wrap up? Okay.
Yeah, so, thank you.